Well, good morning, everyone. And Michael, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I also have to say thank you for inviting me to be here when it is going to be 96 degrees in Richmond, Virginia today. In fact, and I will say this at the off chance you'll think I'm crazy, when we walked out through those doors, my first reaction was, oh, the air conditioning is on really high. So thank you so much. There is really no place that I would rather be than here with you all today in this extraordinary amphitheater. And in fact, I have a very dear friend from college who has come here many times, and when I told her I would be here this week, she expressed such great excitement because, in her words, the Chautauqua institution is a place of thoughtful discourse. And I believe that at this moment for our country and the world, there could be no more important place and no more important opportunity than to exchange in civil dialogue. I also want to thank the leadership of the Chautauqua Institution for the invitation to join David French as an inaugural Perry Fellow. And I will be forever grateful to Marnette and Paul Perry, who, as Michael has described, as important community leaders who care so deeply about the work that individuals and institutions like Chautauqua and the University of Virginia can and must do for our society in this moment. And Marnette and Paul, I will be forever grateful for the two of you for illuminating the path forward at this critical moment. So thank you so much. So speaking of institutions, here we are in this extraordinary place, this beautiful place. Everyone is fueled by their morning coffee, and we are here to focus on a critical issue that is surprisingly, to me, not top of mind for everyone: the American presidency. So on this morning of the first presidential debate, we must ask the question, why? While often misunderstood and sometimes maligned, make no mistake, but the presidency and the executive branch have in some way touched everything from the coffee maker that you used this morning, to the road that you used to get here today, to the people with whom you engage in your office or in your apartment building, to the food that you will have for lunch. And that's why I want to engage in a conversation with you about the evolution of the modern presidency and how the power and the authority vested in that office and in the executive branch profoundly shape our lives. I spent the first 3 years of the Obama administration, as Michael mentioned, working in the White House. I was honored to serve, and I remember the day that I called my parents with the news that then President-elect Barack Obama had asked me to serve as the director of the Domestic Policy Council. I called Mom and Dad. I said, look, I've got exciting news. They had been big supporters, and when I told them, they expressed such pride and such excitement. Right before my mother said, sweetheart, that is just wonderful, but what is that? Now, my mother's reaction isn't surprising. It was clear to us, anyway, when we went into the White House, that it could be a confusing place for people. We often drew a direct line between our jobs and the jobs of Leo and CJ and Josh of the popular TV show, The West Wing. That's the way people understood what we did. And after all, what we know is that the apparatus surrounding the presidency is often opaque, and it feels less accessible to everyday people, certainly less understandable than Congress, the place where I began my career in Washington, the first institution that was constitutionally crafted by the framers, and as I'll highlight in detail in a few minutes, a critical actor if in fact the presidency is going to work well and effectively. In fact, I see Congress as a key entry point for how we think about the presidency, not only because of my own experiences working across those institutions, but because they are deeply intertwined in the practice of governing. But more on that in a few minutes. The vibrancy of democratic institutions, including the presidency, and their role in meeting the needs, demands, and expectations of the public are not only at the heart of our conversation this morning, but core to my current role as Executive Director of the Karsh Institute at the University of Virginia. And my colleagues and I work to understand and defend and invigorate the institutions, practices, and cultural underpinnings that serve the foundation of democracy. And one of our key goals is to translate and to make sure the best scholarship and research are ready for action and enable students and policymakers and business leaders and nonprofit leaders to tackle democracy's most pressing challenges. It goes without saying that this topic has never been more timely, as we look forward to what arguably will be one of the most consequential presidential elections in our history, and we find ourselves at a pivotal moment. Today, much of the American people and much of the American public feels disillusioned with the functioning of the federal government. And when citizens lose faith in the government and the institutions that are government and believe that those in power don't hold their best interests at heart, then the foundation of self-government begins to erode and the body politic begins to fail. Our aspirations for the United States will struggle to come to fruition when, according to a recent Pew Research Center study, only 20% of Americans say they trust government in Washington to do what is right most or all of the time. That's just a fifth of our fellow citizens. Our fellow citizens, and probably most of us here today, would agree that it is difficult, if not impossible, to solve for problems when that is the case, when there's declining trust in the federal government. 60 years of data tell us that 1964, that was the year that I was born, 1964 is the high watermark for public trust in the federal government. And a December 2023 Hart Research poll tells us that the public believes that democracy is rotting from the top down, not atrophying from the bottom up. 69% blame irresponsible leaders who don't respect our democracy and want power at any cost. This disillusionment is on the part of many citizens could be seen as reflecting a sense that government is not meeting their needs or the needs of those they care about. They question whether their vote will carry any weight at all, and in fact, research shows that young voters, voters between the ages of 18 and 34, as well as people of color, have expressed openness to, quote, a system that gives a strong leader the power to get things done. Now that could be interpreted in lots of many ways, but some of them are certainly chilling. When it comes to our elected national leaders, we've often heard that the public's opinion of Congress continues to decline. And late-night comedian Stephen Colbert, drawing on polling data, says that Congress is less popular than colonoscopies. For the gastroenterologists in the audience, I will just do a little, everybody should get a colonoscopy, but that said, much of public discontent is also directed towards the presidency. Voters are keenly aware that in 2 presidential elections in our lifetimes, the presidents have been elected without a majority of the popular vote. And each time this happens, there are calls to abolish the Electoral College because it doesn't appear to reflect the views and the ideas and the sentiments of the public. Now, at issue is whether the Electoral College is properly representative, and I understand that and I ponder those same questions, but I also wonder whether abolishing that system might also exacerbate issues of representation, polarization, and distrust. Large population centers, because of their sheer numbers, can essentially determine presidents and ensure their issues receive priority, while other parts of the country become a permanent minority. Either way, Americans are discontent over representation, even as we expect a great deal from our president, the person who is the nation's most visible officer and the only branch of government led by a unitary actor. So today, I'd like us to consider how the presidency has evolved over time in the face of competing demands, to remain bound on the one hand to its constitutional design, and on the other hand, to respond to an evolving country and world and ever-changing citizen demands, and more broadly, why this matters for our deeply divided nation. So specifically, I want us to grapple with a few questions. What is and what should be the purpose of the president and the executive branch? What is the president's role in advancing an agenda that addresses the nation's needs? And finally, does the 21st century presidency work? To even begin to answer these questions, it's imperative to first look backward in time. Now, for those of you who, like me, were history majors or you're historians, you're thinking, oh, this is great. For those of you who hated history, I promise this will matter, and hopefully you will also appreciate it. While many of the framers of the Constitution knew their political philosophy and history, drawing on Roman and other models of government, the Constitution set forth a new experiment in collective self-government. And they crafted it amid great uncertainty and also with many compromises. When the framers outlined the principles and central institutions of American government, their overarching goal was to reconcile a belief in the capacity of people for self-government with the need to temper human nature and limit arbitrary power. While figures like Alexander Hamilton, for all of us who saw the musical, you could hear it, the lyrics in your head, you know that he made a compelling case for a strong and energetic executive as central to effective government. Others were wary of executive power and feared that concentrating too much power in the hands of a single actor could breed tyranny and the reemergence of monarchical authority. From these debates emerged the institution of the American presidency, with specific powers set forth in the Constitution that most of us are familiar with and that we could probably rattle off. The power to sign legislation or to veto it, to command the armed forces, to appoint, with the advice and the consent of the Senate, justices to the Supreme Court, to convene or adjourn Congress, to grant reprieves and pardons, and to receive foreign ambassadors. What also emerged was a presidency that was embedded within and critical to the broader system of checks and balances, designed to limit the dominance of a single branch in the federal government. Beyond constitutional mandates, the expectations for what the presidency ought to be were often set by our nation's first presidential examples. So think back to George Washington. Now, he sought, and he was very intentional about this, to establish a tradition of respect and reverence for the office, while also taking great care to ensure the office did not put on monarchical or aristocratic airs. He sought to set precedents through his actions just as much, if not more, than his words, being meticulously aware of how he conducted himself, from how he entered a room, to simply walking on the street as opposed to riding in a carriage, to stepping down from office after 2 terms. In a time of extreme anxiety, remember, this is the very beginning of the country. We didn't know how this was going to work. So there was extreme anxiety over the possibility of a president becoming too powerful in this young nation. This intentionality even manifested itself in Washington's fashion choices. So take yourself back to the inauguration of George Washington. If you were there and a spectator, what you would have seen was Washington wearing a plain, homespun brown coat. And you would imagine that he was signaling his respect for occupying a position of public trust in a republic. And yet, perhaps symbolizing the tension between the presidency's constitutional constraints and the power and the prestige of the presidency to come. If you look down, you would have seen diamonds on his shoes. The presidency has evolved and ultimately expanded from that moment in time in response to the needs and demands emerging from an enlarged territorial state, the growth of an industrial economy, and a vastly increased population. Over time, America's body politic has expanded to include more and more people, and that is a good thing. Through the franchise's extension to women and people of color and young adults starting at age 18, and that has also profoundly influenced the demands on the office. Added to that, the opportunities and challenges of the 21st century are legion. From the rise of the global economy, rapid technological advancements, to sophisticated threats to national security, along with increased concerns about environmental pollution and ecological harm, reduced mobility and increased persistent steep inequality, and of course, a not so long ago crisis in global public health. More and more is being demanded from the government today, and the modern president oversees 15 executive departments and over 2,000 agencies on a whole host of topics, from education to agriculture to homeland security. And I can tell you, I was one of 3 co-heads of the review of agencies as we were going into the transition in 2008, early 2009. And even I found it jaw-dropping when I realized the number of agencies and the size of the executive branch. I also remember walking into the White House in January of 2009. It was just a few hours after I'd been seated on the west front of the Capitol to watch Barack Obama take the oath of office. And I had to report to my office that day, along with about a dozen other assistants to the president. And while I'd been to the West Wing before, and President Bush's domestic policy advisor had been so gracious in inviting me over to the White House for lunch and giving me a briefing during the transition, this was the first time I had walked into my office. And at that point, I literally could not have told you where the restroom was. But when I crossed the threshold into my office, the phone was ringing. I picked it up, and the person on the other end had a question. And it wasn't a, "Hey, Melody, how's it going? Congratulations on your first day of work" kind of a question. It was a substantive policy question. And it drove home a point. The government never sleeps, and the demands on government are constant. Now, against the backdrop of a nation far larger, far more populous, and more diverse than the founders of this country could have ever imagined, and the relentless demands that emerge, we should consider the second question that I posed. What is and what should be the role of the president in touching the lives of everyday Americans and advancing an agenda that meets their needs? Across time, many, many presidents have sought to do the most good for the most people, often expanding the depth and the breadth of the executive authority along those lines. Dwight Eisenhower's creation of the interstate highway system not only revolutionized transportation and commerce, but also spurred economic growth, facilitated the massive expansions of citizens into the suburbs, reshaping cities and communities which benefited many people, though not everyone, and altered the daily lives of Americans by making cross-country travel an accessible reality. Similarly, Richard Nixon's establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency brought federal oversight into environmental protection and expanded the executive branch's role in focusing on clean air and clean water. Before Eisenhower and Nixon, Theodore Roosevelt transformed the presidency by vastly expanding the presidential powers and placing the presidency at the center of the political arena in a way that it had never been before. Congress had been the most powerful branch of government throughout the second half of the 1800s. And although the presidency was gaining in power near the end of the century, Roosevelt completed that transformation. TR made the presidency and the executive branch, as opposed to the legislative branch or political parties, the center of American politics. He challenged notions of small government and thought the president could use any and all powers not denied him by the Constitution to serve as an agent of change for public reform and progress. Roosevelt used the presidency to transform welfare legislation, government regulations, and spearhead the conservation movement. We can still see Roosevelt's legacy in FDR's New Deal, in Truman's Fair Deal, in Kennedy's New Frontier, and notably, LBJ's Great Society. Now, speaking of LBJ, I have long seen his administration as a salient case study in presidential authority. While Lyndon Johnson's legacy will always be shaped by Vietnam, and he is either typically loved or despised, his presidency marks another transformative moment for the institution and serves as a masterclass in the use of presidential power to touch the lives of the American people. Popular culture and political lore cast Johnson as a cunning, homespun, often crude Texas bully, a masterful legislator who aided and abetted white supremacists early in his career. While there is some truth to all of that, the facts are more complicated than this depiction of Johnson and his legacy. Johnson pursued his ambition to be president, and make no bones about it, he desperately wanted to be president. And he battled personal demons, self-inflicted wounds, and the obstacles that were pushed in his path by others. He was feared and respected as Senate Majority Leader, and Vice President Johnson, however, was reduced to a joke. If he was lucky, he was an afterthought. During the 3 years sandwiched between his role dominating the United States Senate and his ascent to the Oval Office, he was so profoundly diminished that he seemed almost broken and forgotten. But once President Kennedy was assassinated in Texas, Johnson assumed the presidency and used government, the Oval Office, and the power amassed over 25 years trying to redress the economic hardship and outsider status that had placed millions of Americans on the periphery of society. Johnson wanted to expand upon Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. In fact, he saw himself as an FDR acolyte. And he thought it robust, but it didn't do enough. It didn't do enough for women, or for people of color, or for immigrants, or for those who remained impoverished. He reveled in and he used his power, even as he set out to change the power dynamic in the country. An unmatched student of the legislative branch, he drove the Great Society agenda, urging Congress to pass one landmark bill after another, touching every aspect of American life: the arts, childhood nutrition, civil rights, education, the environment, government transparency, health care, rural economic development, and the list goes on and on. The 5 years, and they were only 5 years, that Lyndon Johnson occupied the Oval Office, he turned American life upside down. Our culture, our politics, citizens' relationship to government, all of that changed. Often his legislative accomplishments are described almost magically. And there's no question, he was a skilled student of the legislative process. But it's important to understand a few things about the man and his use of presidential power. First, yes, Johnson believed in an active government, and he believed the president should leverage the power of the office to transform the country. As Congresswoman Barbara Jordan said about him toward the end of her life, he stripped the government of its neutrality and made it an agent on behalf of the people. The Great Society agenda, as I mentioned, was bold and vast. It included Medicare, and Medicaid, Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the establishment of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, aid to small business, the Child Nutrition Act, the Highway Safety Act, and so much more, including the civil rights legislation that Jack Kennedy had put before Congress but was being blocked by Southern Democrats. And although he had been a part of that group, Johnson decided that his first speech to Congress would announce civil rights legislation as a priority. His aides were adamantly opposed. When they told him, look, this is a noble cause, but it is a lost cause, Johnson responded, well, what the hell is the presidency for then? And in doing so, he transformed America. However, while one might disagree with Johnson's active government agenda, Johnson worked inside institutional parameters and with Congress to achieve his great society goals. Yes, he was a master of the Senate rules. Yes, he used his physical bearing and strategic, some would say ruthless mind, to architect a legislative path and win the votes he needed. Yes, he used the bully pulpit. But the reality is that Johnson's sweeping successes came when he won a big majority in Congress after the 1964 election. There was no magic. When he didn't have those big majorities, he lost votes like everyone else, including his first attempts to pass Medicare and Medicaid. When I was in the Obama administration, if I had $1 for every time someone said to us, you should just be more like LBJ, I would be a very, very wealthy woman. But I recognize that that entreaty was a statement about the challenges that were facing the country during that time and the hopes that were harbored by many for sweeping changes. When we walked into the White House in January of 2009, remember, just think back, the nation was further descending into the Great Recession. Financial institutions were in free fall. The auto industry was teetering on the brink of collapse. Students were challenged in their efforts to find and to secure loans for college. And that month alone, the economy lost over 800,000 jobs in 1 month. I remember doing my work, shaping policy, and I would have to go back and check those figures because they were almost unimaginable. I also often recall the voices of those I had encountered on the campaign trail and when I was in the White House. The woman I met who was a cancer survivor, but whose vocal cords had been compromised. I remember meeting her on the campaign trail. I was at a house party and we were standing in a hallway. I literally can still remember where I was standing and talking to her about healthcare and healthcare reform. I remember the young mother who was an immigrant who had become a legal citizen trying to navigate the education system with her young son. And I will never, ever forget the young man that I met who had been found in the trash as an infant. Literally found in the trash. And the path that he was trying to carve for himself and for his family. President Obama also focused on those individuals. You may have heard about, and it was true, that he requested every day 10 letters from constituents to remain focused on the challenges that were being faced by those counting on us. I remember him often saying in response to our policy ideas, sometimes holding one of those letters, yes, but will it solve this person's problem? In other words, were we addressing people's concrete needs or merely developing solutions that might work in theory, but not necessarily in practice? With that in mind, and his experience in the Illinois State House and the US Senate, Our objective was to work with Congress to advance an agenda that improved K-12 education, that made college more accessible and affordable, that took steps to address climate change, and the list goes on, including passing comprehensive health care legislation. That road to passing the Affordable Care Act was a long one, and it goes back as far as the Truman administration. By 2008, almost every president for 60 years had attempted to advance robust health care legislation and had failed. President Obama, urged by the American public and against the backdrop of a health care accessibility crisis, decided to use his political capital to do so. And there were times along that path that we debated and questioned whether or not we should try for comprehensive reform. And I remember the president saying to one of my colleagues one day, if I listened to you this year, I'd pass coverage for your pinky, and next week I'd pass it for your ankle, and next year I'd pass it for your arm. We're going to do this now. The path to passage in March 2010 was full of hurdles, including various and competing stakeholder demands, the need to address the complex issue of abortion, the illness and death of the Senate leader on the legislation, Ted Kennedy, and our months-long and often ridiculed efforts to try and garner bipartisan support. Ultimately, we wouldn't secure a single Republican vote, but we persisted working with congressional Democrats because President Obama believed that we were addressing a vital need as expressed by millions of people, and that this was our window to do it. In fact, after the bill was passed, literally that very same evening, it passed late at night. It was about 11 o'clock, and the president invited us to the residence to have a toast standing on the Truman balcony. And it was a really unusually warm March night. And I remember standing there, and the Washington Monument was in the background, and we were talking and laughing and feeling pretty good. And I'll never forget what the president said. And he said, "Tonight, this is better than election night, because this is why we came here." Now, I know that the debate continues over the Affordable Care Act, but I firmly believe that President Obama was right, and time will support his sentiment. When COVID struck, the Medicaid expansion program was a lifesaver, literally. Today, 40 states have adopted it. And earlier this month, the Financial Times reported that the ACA and Medicaid expansion contributed to strengthen U.S. hiring, accounting for half the jobs in the past 12 months. And the programs have helped build resilience in the wake of interest rate increases. 14 years after the bill was signed into law, health care coverage has been provided to about 20 million previously uninsured people, while very likely, based on the last Congressional Budget Office estimates and other studies, positively affecting the budget. My point is that transformative legislation was signed into law, legislation deeply touching Americans' lives, but even when Democrats had majorities in the House and Senate, they were not LBJ-sized majorities, and they were lost by 2010. And once lost, there appeared to be little opportunity to pass legislation, and my colleagues and I explored opportunities to move the president's agenda using executive authority. The authority to issue executive orders is a legitimate power in our constitutional system. Historically, we often, not always, but we often celebrate them. Think about it. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Truman's order to desegregate the U.S. military, Eisenhower's order to support the desegregation of schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. And their authority can be found in existing law. However, executive orders and other forms of executive power can exist under a cloud of uncertainty, including the possibility of being rescinded by a future president. Let me give you an example. 12 years ago, President Obama implemented Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, or DACA. Many of you may be familiar with this program. It allows for young immigrants, those brought to the United States as children when they had no control over their own lives, to remain in the country legally. President Trump attempted to end the program, also by an executive order, but a 5-4 Supreme Court left the program in place. Today, the program continues, but it's caught in a web of litigation, including a district court decision deeming it unlawful, and the likelihood that former President Trump will try to eliminate it again should he become the 47th President of the United States. That said, administrations, Republican and Democrat, are increasingly pushing the boundaries to meet public expectations that the President act boldly and swiftly. Presidents know that they will be the focal point for judgment, unlike the praise or the blame that's spread across 535 individuals sitting at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. In some ways, it's kind of like school teachers. Often people say, I love my teacher, but I'm really angry with the public schools. People can love their member of Congress, but still be really, really angry, or in fact, loathe Congress, as I talked about before. That is true even though Congress, the branch of government closest to people, and designed to serve as a catalyst for action, is often hamstrung by polarization. It's a common refrain that Congress is not willing or able to move an agenda to serve the American people, and in response, executive authority is often used to take up the slack. President Biden has passed an impressive Great Society era-like suite of legislation, but if polls are to be believed, the American people are deeply dissatisfied. Frustrated by a divided Congress, animated by his desire to respond to the public, and with his campaign for re-election on the line, the President has sometimes turned to executive authority. The Education Secretary's plan to relieve student debt being one of the most prominent and generally popular examples. But last year, the Supreme Court pushed back, and in a 6-3 decision, ruled this specific use of executive authority did not comply with the law. And that has led the Biden administration to propose a new plan. But earlier, just this week, Missouri and Kansas courts blocked the administration's efforts to reduce and cancel student debt. Again, this is what the challenge looks like when executive authority is often deployed. So 21st century presidencies prompt us to ask two questions. Are they responding to us? Are we asking too much of the president? Should we be asking more of Congress? We may also need to recalibrate We also may need to recalibrate what we think is possible or even normal for a president to accomplish during their administration. There are so many demands on presidential power. While some presidents have given us the impression they do have the power, perhaps we need to consider not just what the president can do to address our needs, but how the three branches must work together to advance the needs of the country. I began my remarks by reminding us of the authority explicitly granted to the president in the Constitution. But we must remember that one of the president's most powerful tools is the bully pulpit, and the power of the presidential voice and image. Our collective vision for who we are and what the nation can be is often shaped by presidential rhetoric. When we think of the truly great presidents, we often think of the speeches they gave and the words that still hold sway with people today. The power that presidents have as orators is unparalleled. From Washington's farewell address to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, FDR's fireside chats, Reagan's speech after the explosion of the Challenger shuttle, to President Bush's ground zero remarks to first responders after 9/11. We remember our presidents for not only what they accomplished, but the words they spoke and how those words helped them engage us to accomplish their aims and solidify their legacies. The advent of television, along with radio, fundamentally altered how presidents connected with the public. The Kennedy and Nixon debate was the first televised presidential debate in history, and those two men, became representative visuals of their viewpoints. In moments of national pride in the wake of tragedy, presidents have used the enormous power of the bully pulpit not only to advance their agendas, but also to connect with and to send a signal to Americans. In moments of collective loss, for example, the American people look to the president as the consoler in chief. The power of words in those moments is tangible and lasting, allowing presidents to place themselves in the same emotional space as the public, to bond with citizens not only in moments of shared glory, but also in moments of shared sorrow and suffering. As suggested with my reference to the first presidential debate on television, sometimes the bully pulpit is composed not only of words, but of images which shape our imagination, again conveying a sense of who we are and what is possible. There's a famous picture, and some of you may be able to conjure it when I describe it. It's one of my favorite photographs. It's of President Obama in the Oval Office. He's bent over at the waist, smiling and bowing his head so that a little black boy can reach out and touch his hair. You can see that child literally wants to feel that this man's hair is like his own. The president is like me. Think of what that means to all of us. The president is like me. This is one of my favorite photos, not just because it captures an extraordinary moment in the lives of a man and a little boy, but because of what it conveys, capturing a simple human gesture about progress toward America's democratic aspirations. Similarly, almost 150 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, I stood in the Oval Office with two other little black boys, my then 12-year-old godson, Robbie, and his 8-year-old brother, Ryan. I had the opportunity to introduce them to President Obama, and Ryan's reaction was one of astonishment. We turned the corner to walk into the outer oval, and there was the president leaning against the door. And Ryan stopped, and he looked, and he said, "Oh my God." It was a verbal expression of the iconic picture that I just described. My godson Robbie was also absorbing the moment, but quietly, and the president noticed that his attention was focused on one single document on the wall, the Emancipation Proclamation. As they discussed it, I was almost overwhelmed by that moment. It wasn't about policy, but the imagery was about a statement of the expansion of American freedom. Both President Obama and President Trump, while very different presidents, understood their megaphone. As a senator, Barack Obama captured national attention in his 2004 Democratic Convention speech in Boston, and he became a dominant political and cultural figure at a pivotal moment. X, or the artist formerly known as Twitter, launched in 2006, and the media landscape, and subsequently the political landscape, was forever altered when Facebook went public in 2012. Years after that Kennedy-Nixon debate, President Obama embraced the way technology was once again fundamentally and radically changing politics. Social media was a new way that presidents could connect directly with people. In fact, media outlets were so frustrated with us because of our ability to put out messages when and where we wanted. And while President Obama was restrained in his use of social media, I think we can all agree that President Trump was not. President Trump is a unique figure at a unique moment in our history. He has tapped into a deep well of American frustration and resentment about politics, the economy, and culture, and brought a very distinct, brash, and urgent voice to a set of beliefs and desires that other politicians were either ignoring, afraid to articulate, or couldn't capture in the same way. While his administration accomplished some of its policy goals, the appointment of justices to the Supreme Court and tax cuts being among the most notable, President Trump himself has become larger than life due to the power of his Twitter and Truth Social-fueled presidential voice. He became known as the Hemingway of 140 characters, as he engaged with the public through social media. While President Trump also re-engaged with and developed close connections with some traditional media outlets, he demonstrated the ways in which technology has revolutionized both how presidents communicate with citizens and how citizens communicate with presidents. During the Trump administration, ordinary people could tweet at the president and sometimes prompt a response from the President of the United States. Through his regular presence in both traditional and social media, he dramatically raised the bar in the expectations he set for what presidents could achieve in one term. And even if the policy didn't follow, the Mexican border wall or repeal of the Affordable Care Act, for example, he is a case study for the tension between presidential rhetoric and the capacity and authority of the institution. Today's citizens have access to more information in real time about news and current events than ever before. And there is no clear or centralized or authoritative communications channel. There are now varied avenues and unlimited time frames for political communication. I mean, who can forget that President Trump used to tweet very early in the morning? And as we sit on the cusp of new digital technologies, it is also an open question as to how AI and generative AI and other data-driven systems will impact political communication. With all of this in mind, the presidency as represented in the Constitution, the power of the bully pulpit, the ever-growing complexity of the country, and the varied and increasing demands of the people, we might ask, does the 21st century presidency work? There are a few ways to think about what it really means for the presidency to work, depending on how we view the role of the presidency itself. One might say that the system is working if presidents can check the boxes that I mentioned a few minutes ago in Article 2 of the Constitution. If they're hosting state dinners or appointing heads of federal agencies, if they're issuing pardons or vetoes, and acting on other powers specifically delegated to the president. But one might also consider the president's functioning across the whole Constitution. Has the modern presidency upset checks and balances? Or by contrast, as embodied in the broader system, is the executive branch responsive enough? Perhaps in the past, the pre-modern presidency wasn't sufficiently able to respond when other branches of government fell short. On one hand, some argue the modern executive branch evolved into what historian Arthur Schlesinger tagged the imperial presidency. In short, the imperial presidency describes an executive branch that has outpaced the other branches of government in scope and depth, especially in the context of war powers. Others understand these challenges very differently, leading President Gerald Ford to assert that the presidency has too little power to be effective. He coined the phrase, the imperiled presidency. This Goldilocks, too much, too little, just right debate requires us to understand that the challenges facing the executive branch today did not happen in a vacuum. Rather, they coincide with and are in part due to a receding and inefficient Congress, belabored by partisan gridlock and inaction, and a demanding public that increasingly wants a strong leader. My view is that if there is a problem with the presidency and presidential power, to fix the presidency, we must also fix Congress. That's a tall order. That's a tall order, and there are many factors at play, from systemic issues like gerrymandered districts to the incentive structures and algorithms that reward performative and clickbait behavior. Yet, there are those in the House and the Senate who also appear to believe that there is a reason to be dissatisfied with the way Congress is operating. The House's Select Committee on Modernization held a hearing a few years ago on how societal trends shape the way Congress works or doesn't, and heard from experts on the ways in which institutional culture of Congress could be reshaped to build a more collaborative culture, thereby reducing hyperpartisanship and encouraging cross-party collaboration. Just this May, and some of you who were here a couple of days ago are familiar with this, a Senate committee gathered experts to address bipartisan concerns about the vast and sweeping powers that become available to the president during declarations of emergency. Powers that Congress granted to the presidency while also ignoring its own obligation to regularly review actions undertaken during declared emergencies. This highlights at least some desire on the part of Congress to restore its role as a check on executive power. As Elizabeth Guatine from the Brennan Center, again, who many of you heard from recently, noted before the Senate committee, presidents during declarations of national emergencies have extraordinary discretion. They could freeze private assets without judicial process, shut down communications infrastructure, control domestic transportation, and even suspend the prohibition on government testing of chemical and biological agents on unwilling human subjects. Now, no president has done this so far, but reliance on presidential self-restraint is poor security. The framers of the Constitution expressly designed political order that aimed to remove dependency on the arbitrary will of those in positions of power. This was one of the key differences for them between arbitrary versus limited government. The presidency works best when situated in its broader institutional context, in which Congress is sometimes its adversary, but sometimes its partner. Today's big challenges require multiple points of input and multiple moments of argument and advocacy, and negotiation and compromise. Our complex system of government is actually what is needed to meet complex challenges. And something for all of us as well. As you're thinking about your vote this fall, and as you get your neighbors, please, to start thinking about the presidency, I ask you to consider this. Your vote for Congress matters a great deal in terms of how the presidency works, how well our system works. While so much media focus will be on the presidential election in the coming months, do not lose sight that your member of Congress is a player on our constitutional team, and their role can impact the functioning of the presidency. I would make a sports analogy here, but I can feel my husband kind of twitching sitting over there, so I'm not going to do that. Your vote might be based on issues, or it might be based on party affiliation, but please add one more criterion to your list. What role will your senator or House member play with regard to the presidency? Will they obstruct? Will they fawn? Or will they disagree and limit when they must, and engage and compromise when they can. I'm going to end with just a few summary points that I hope you'll take away from this talk about the way presidents and the executive branch touch our lives. Without question, presidents can wield immense power, even those who advocate for small government. That power includes laws and regulations, but it also includes culture and narrative, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. The bully pulpit is formidable, and a president's voice and image are among his most powerful and effective tools. However, for presidents to be able to do their work well and effectively, they need Congress. I found this to be critical in my walk with members of the House and Senate and presidents. And finally, and of critical importance, we the public must engage thoughtfully as well. In representative democracy, we have a role, and our expectations and demands and choices will shape the presidency, giving it purpose, direction, and meaning. To leave you all with one last snippet of the power of presidential voice, I want to turn back to LBJ's famous speech following President Kennedy's death, and perhaps foreshadowing his decision not to run for re-election 5 years later. He said, "Every president has to establish with the various sectors of the country what I call the right to govern. Just being elected to office does not guarantee him that right. Every president has to inspire the confidence of the people. Every president has to become a leader, and to be a leader, you must attract people who are willing to follow him. Every president has to develop a moral underpinning to his power, or soon discovers that he has no power at all." I say, indeed, a president's moral authority is directly related to today's topic. How that individual uses the power of the office to touch our lives and respond to our needs. Presidents committed to that goal, in ways large and small, will sometimes find themselves in positions of tension within the federal system and possibly between the limits of constitutional design and the aspirations people have for democracy. But those productive tensions, even within the presidency itself, might just be what the framers of the Constitution had in mind as they set in motion a system of collective self-government aimed at the common good. Thank you.